that. So I'm going to do several things tonight. The first thing is to um, define voting rights and talk a little bit about what our Constitution does and does not do. I'm sure the League participants know this. I'm not sure if it's understood widely within communities. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the progression of expansion as at the same the paradox of exclusion and expansion. That's been a long part of our history as a republic, and a republic attempting to practice democratic principles. But we always have to begin with the fundamental question: democracy for whom, and voting for whom. So that's something that I will discuss and cover. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the consequences of recent court decisions. Some of you who've heard about that monumental, earth-shattering Shelby decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And we are actually now experiencing many of the consequences of that action. And that action is directly tied to the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the progression throughout the 20th century. So let me, and then finally, I want to talk about voter repression or suppression and the way that other factors impact it. It's not simply about who can and who cannot vote, but it's also about who can and who cannot get on the ballot. That also has an impact that can be repressive as well. Sometimes for the good. Many of you may have heard about efforts to invoke a particular part of the 14th Amendment that prevents certain individuals from running for office. But there are also other socioeconomic factors that can repress representation by virtue of the access to the actual ballot and being listed on the ballot. So that's generally what I will do. And once again, if any of you have questions in the meantime, please do not hesitate to let Rachel know, and I will try to respond as quickly as possible. So you all know, and the assumption is that voting is a constitutional right. It is, but it's conflictual. There are constitutional provisions for the right to vote, but the right to vote is not necessarily guaranteed by our Constitution, because the actual power to control elections and to register voters and determine who has access to the ballot is retained by the states. And this is why when we talk about voter repression, we look at the actions of the state and the states, and they have been very, very busy. Some very positive, some very negative. And then certainly there are political party functions that determine not only voting laws, because voting and the right to vote becomes a very effective campaign issue, but political parties serve as intermediaries to determine who can actually run for offices. And there are factors that can prevent or encourage access to the ballot, being listed on the ballot, that some of you may know of. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution also creates the electors in each state. And electors, as you know, when it comes to one specific election, our presidential election, we have an electoral college, and many consider that as being an institutional impediment to voicing the true will of the people. And there have been many current discussions about dismantling the Electoral College and relying solely and only on the popular vote. But we know that the Electoral College arose out of politics in a particular era when there was concern that the popular vote would grant greater powers to some as states as opposed to others. And then we get into the 3/5 clause and so on and so forth. So essentially, the bottom line is that voting and who does have access to the ballot, who can vote and who cannot vote, is really all about power. In all of my courses, I begin orienting students with this understanding and definition of power. And politics is about determining who gets what, when, where, and how. And power is behind the politics of that determination. Amendments that have affected the right to vote are found in the original Constitution, and certainly the 3/5 clause that denied full personhood and as well as citizenship to enslaved persons, the majority of whom were of African descent, African Americans. And we know the whole history of the Civil War. I don't need to retell that. Subsequent to the end of the Civil War, you have very important amendments that impact the inclusion and also the granting of citizenship to former enslaved African Americans. But people fail to understand that those civil rights amendments of the Civil War and Reconstruction also made it possible for waves of new immigrants from certain areas of Europe that were originally undesirable to also gain citizenship, as well as Native Americans and new criteria as to, sovereignty and sovereign rights. So after the Civil War, we saw the remaking of the system somewhat. The 15th Amendment, the right of citizens was given to persons and shall not be denied or abridged by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, including indentured servitude. The 19th Amendment expanded the right to vote, as we all know, to women. Originally, African American women were left out of the 15th Amendment rights given to African American males. And then the 26th Amendment, 1971, during the Vietnam era, that extended the right to vote to 18-year-olders. And so far, none of these amendments have been nullified by states, can be nullified. And we do know that despite what the legal inclusion, the manipulation of other variables within states and within the electoral system actually undercut those constitutional provisions. Because of the way our Constitution functions, our Constitution is a beautiful, very nimble document because of its generality. It's not too specific in many cases, and it may tell us an overall goal, but it does not prescribe how it should be done and what should be done and what should not be done until the courts become involved. So we do, and this is where we get into the realm of voter repression and manipulation. Although the 15th Amendment was to prevent the abridgment of the vote on account of race and color, we do know that there were still quite a bit of animus towards African Americans and non-whites. And this was not limited to the South, even though right here in Connecticut, by the Civil War, there was an extended voting rights. But in the history of Connecticut, African Americans were granted the right to vote, and then the right to vote was taken away, then it was given back again, so on and so forth. So one of the things that we have to understand about voter repression is that it's not limited to just one region of the country. In fact, Connecticut, up until last year, Connecticut very often was ranked with I think it was Mississippi and Alabama when it came to the access to the ballot, in terms of the difficulties that Connecticut citizens could encounter in terms of voter access. So I raised that only, and I referenced last year because of the early voting. Connecticut was one of 3 states, the other 2 being in the South, the historical South, that did not have early voting provisions. And so my point is that when we talk about voter repression, suppression, and restrictions, it is not sectional. It is not regional. It happens all across the country in varying and very unique ways. So we do know that the more egregious voter repression history and the more observable empirical voter repression strategies occurred after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, in which African state legislatures, largely in the South, enacted laws that were intended, and it was blatant, and it was, there was no deception. When you look at some of the transcripts of legislative sessions, they state outright, we've come to exclude, at the time, the Negro. I mean, it's right there, right in your face. So it's pretty clear. And the tactics range from literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. So I'm sure all of you heard of those. A couple of things about the poll tax. The concept of the poll tax was not invented by Americans and American white Southerners, white male Southerners largely. That concept of the poll tax actually is shared historically, even throughout parts of Europe. And as late as the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher had expressed some policy preferences toward establishing a poll tax of sorts in Great Britain at the time or during her prime ministership. So some of these things and concepts and strategies are not unique and not limited to the United States, if we want to take a global view about democracy. So you've probably heard some of the stories about the kind of ridiculous literacy tests questions, how many, jelly beans in a jar, draw a figure, divided in half by drawing a straight line from the northeast corner to the southeast corner, then divided by drawing a broken line from the middle of its western side to the middle of the eastern side. These were very complicated tests. And the truth is, and then of course there was the demand that some African American males translate Greek and Latin text. And despite the fact that there are instances in which you had highly educated African American males who actually did translate, who had had classical educations and had returned to the South and actually read them, they still did not get the right to vote. So we do know that the goal was to simply exclude African Americans. And I'm talking about in the state of Mississippi, one of the legislatures, Solomon Calhoun, for example, in proceedings when the state legislature met to draft a new constitution after the Civil War, he goes and he gets on the floor and he says, "We came here to exclude the Negro." And that's exactly what they did in terms of coming up with very sometimes subtle, but most times very overt ways of circumventing the 15th Amendment. And of course, we have this progression of other strategies in terms of interference, in terms of getting to the polls, interference in terms of the use of terrorism. And out of this came certainly the Ku Klux Klan and other threats and intimidations to prevent individuals from voting. And these are very blatant in the South. But once again, I must say that when you look at the history of certain segments, other sections of the country with different populations, you have very similar strategies. Not only, and it in some areas of the country extended these strategies were used to prevent new immigrants and very poor white Americans also from voting, threatening pressures, threats in terms of employment and debt, and so on and so forth. So we do see that we have a history and a legacy of manipulating environments, unfortunately, to prevent individuals from voting. But I want to stop there and make the point. The question should always be why? What was the motivation? And that's why I start with this direct through line from voting to power. Why do you want to repress individuals and keep certain individuals out of the system? Well, politics determines who gets something, when they get it, and how they get it. And if there is this perception about the loss of power or threats to power, this is really the very simple motivation. It's not really rocket science at all, especially when you ask the question, what populations are targeted? What populations are repressed? And what populations gain? And although the knee-jerk reaction is to always racialize it, it becomes a little bit more complex than that, because we can get into other group interests, age, for example, the elderly, the young, workers, and special needs in more modern terms. So it's all about power, and we have to think critically in terms of who else it impacts. It's not simply it manifests itself more clearly when we talk about race and ethnicity, but behind that are some other major impacts as well. You also, because of the structure of our system and because of our federalist structure, you have states that were very busy repressing, even though the Constitution was amended, and this is still going on. We see it now in Alabama, in which Alabama has been told by the courts on numerous occasions that their voter redistricting maps are unconstitutional. But here's the problem. Who's going to make them change it when the legislature is not inclined to do so? And so we enter into this question about enforcement. And enforcement today and enforcement strategies today will have to look very different from the enforcement strategies like a civil war in 2 centuries ago. So although many of these, the grandfather clause, poll taxes, so on and so forth, were struck down by the federal courts, we are faced with a very different, well, a similar, but subtle and probably less than not quickly understood environment in which the courts can rule and make judgment, but we are also in an environment today, just as we were in the 19th century, in which if you have institutions like the courts that are not respected and are viewed as being less than legitimate, they may, they and will make judgments. But once again, if the perception that, oh, we don't need to even listen to the court because, you know, the court is la, 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 la. And yeah, so when we talk about voter suppression, we also have to put it into a much larger political context and ask what's happening to the whole, within the whole political system, because questions about the legitimacy of institutions can mitigate against laws and judgments that attempt to correct and to stop the suppression. But if nobody's going to listen to the courts, and in the instance of Alabama, if you have an entire state legislature that's not even going to listen to the courts, we're in a very dangerous situation that kind of looks like what happened 2 centuries ago. But I'm digressing. When we look at voter repression, as I said, when it comes to race, we can when we control for race, it is the most obvious. So, for example, the data do show a couple of things. So past and present, and everybody's always asking, well, things are better, aren't they? Well, one of the things that has occurred is that when we look at the numbers, we began to see that maybe not. For example, in 1964, the percentage of registered adults, according to race, registered to vote, 5% were white and 5% were African American. And that was the statistical reality that the Voting Rights Act was attempted to mitigate. If we look now at the data and we look at not only percentages of populations according to race, age, as well as income, we find that there's actually been this slide back to fewer and fewer, not only registrants, but also amongst those who are registered, fewer and fewer actually going out to vote for many, many different reasons. And we can talk about some of those other reasons. So it's not simply, so repression, voter suppression has many layers. Not only is it about access to registration, but access to precincts, and also the motivation to actually vote. When you hear individuals say, and I encounter this in classrooms all the time, in which there will be a few students who will say, well, my vote really doesn't count, especially presidential elections, because the Electoral College, so on and so forth. Well, that, and if that thought is also reinforced by systemic or environmental signals as well, you don't have to actually come up with any legal means of repressing people and suppressing the vote, because people will just not be motivated to vote. So we're talking about a very, very large environment. Political systems, so voting occurs and elections occur within a social, economic, political, geographical environment. So there are many, many tiers and aspects and interactions that can bring about the same type of can have the same effect as actual legal means of repressing. And we have to be very, very sensitive to that as well, if the goal is to encourage individuals to become much more active politically. It's not simply about legal strategies of suppression. For example, if you live in a community in which, or I recall the presidential election of 2000, and Florida is always a lightning rod for a lot of stuff, and even during the Civil War and Reconstruction, Florida was one of those states. But do any of you recall some of the news reports that in certain communities there was this a rumor going around that if individuals went out to vote and they had bench warrants or outstanding traffic tickets, they were going to be arrested. So here you have legally registered individuals who have who have registered legally, they have the proper IDs, everything for all intents, they know where their voting polls are, they know what poll they should report to. But then you get this rumor that if this is a part of your life and your environment, you better not go out to vote because you will be in danger. Now that's not so there's nothing that legal that can be prosecuted in that instance if you believe that your life is at risk. And it's intimidation, but if it's intimidation coming from, just rumor, that becomes difficult. And aren't we in a situation now in our polarized political system in which we're dealing with myth and realities, beliefs, and it may not be true, but I believed that it was true, and this is the way I behaved. That's a complicated and very nuanced form of dynamic or level of dynamic that can have a repressive outcome as well. So I'm just saying, we're talking about some very, very, we have to take the whole environmental view in order to understand what is possible and what may actually be going on. So I digressed. I hope no one got lost in that. So the 20th century creates a major sea change. And this is where I want to put everything into the larger context when it comes to what happens in the 1960s. What happens in the 1960s in our country has to be put in and understood as part of a larger set of global dynamics as well. What was World War I characterized as? Well, the war that made the world safe for what? Democracy, right? And then World War II. And in fact, most of the leaders of the 20th century civil rights movement, first of all, you have the civil rights movement that begins, or at least the civil rights movement of the African American community begins at the very beginning with enslavement. I mean, it really starts then with lawsuits going back to 1619. I know that might be controversial, say 1619, but it actually does start then when you get into the historical documents and the appeals and the challenges to enslavement and notions of inclusion and so on and so forth. But when we get to the 20th century, we're talking about the 20th century's version or continuation of this long struggle for freedom and democracy, led by African Americans, and many of those male leaders, in particular, were World War II veterans, and veterans who had laid down their lives, just like African Americans in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Spanish American, every single civil war, or every single war had this mythos that it was about democracy and preserving democracy and protecting democracy for Americans. But in each instance, historically, it was other Americans, but not you Americans. But something happens dramatically different in the 20th century globally. We have this two-part global war, and at the ideological center of that war was democracy versus authoritarian systems. Democracies that would be inclusive versus authoritarian systems that may have certain democratic elements, such as voting, but in authoritarian systems, it was clear that certain powerful actors would determine who had rights and who did not have rights. And so when we get to the 20th century, we see this global movement towards a more liberal interpretation of democracy and freedom that would be expansive. And that meant that Jim Crow and racial exclusion and American apartheid could no longer be maintained. And so we get to the 60s and a political environment in which Congress is much more inclined to intervene in ways that it hadn't since the Reconstruction era. And in 1962, Congress passed the 24th Amendment outlawing the poll tax. You know, the poll tax, remember the poll tax that we thought was wrong during Reconstruction, but what happened after Reconstruction? Reconstruction was dismantled, so it was retained in some areas, more observably in the South And pardon me, something happened to my computer and I have to go back to my notes. So, and in 1965, those literacy tests were outlawed and the Voting Rights Act was passed. And the Voting Rights Act had two very powerful sections. The first section was that it contained the formula that defined which jurisdictions were subject to um, jurisdictions were subject to provisions of the Act. A jurisdiction was subject to the Voting Rights Act if it had used a test or a device like the literacy test or poll tax as a condition for voter eligibility, and its overall voting rate was less than 50%. So the Voting Rights Act really targeted those southern states that were much more overt about their repressive actions and behaviors. And I want to stop here and say once again that the South was not the only place where you had repression. The South was targeted because it was just so blatant, right? It was not kind of nice, nasty. It was really nasty. But there were other areas. So when we look at California and we look at the treatment of Mexican Americans, for example, or the Southwest, you have very similar impositions and structures that kept them out as well. And other regions, perhaps cities, because our country is federalist, and you have such fragmentation, a lot of things could be occurring in very isolated, unknown regions or areas that we don't hear much about. But nonetheless, the injustice is still there, but we know very little about it. That's why these large national movements are so liberating, because it opens the door for everyone's mistreatment to be addressed structurally, rather than kind of allowing things to occur in regions where we don't hear much about. You don't hear much about what's going on in Benton Harbor, Michigan, or the UP, small towns. So there could be a lot of these very similar phenomena happening on a local level that we don't know about. And so one of the good things about national legislation and laws is that they address the entire structure. So that was Section 4. Section 5 was a pre-clearance requirement. And what pre-clearance meant was that the jurisdictions that were subject to the Voting Rights Act had to, whenever there was some effort to change the structure of their voting systems, they would have to get pre-clearance from the federal government. And these two sections are under the authority of Congress. So here's something very important to understand. Congress has an immense amount of power when it comes to preserving or denying voting rights. So one of the things that has come out of recent changes throughout many, many states, and I'll talk about this shortly, could be addressed by Congress through legislation. But Congress, since the 1960s, has not passed major voting rights legislation that could even guarantee voting rights guarantee voter access and legislation that could be cast very specifically to target many of the bad behaviors that we see going on right now. But Congress has been very resistant to do it. It doesn't take a constitutional amendment. I mean, a constitutional amendment could, a blanket constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote above the states and so on and so forth, and addressing specifics could occur. But as you all know, our Constitution is pretty difficult to amend. But Congress can pass legislation to target specifics, but Congress has not done so because we have a Congress that is made up of individuals with interest that are voted into office using the very rules that can either advance interests or suppress interests. So we are in a very sticky wicket. So for the most part, after 1965, the jurisdictions subject to pre-clearance and under the Voting Rights Act were the southern states, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, I think it's Arizona, Alaska, as well. And then you had a few that were also, excuse me, I have to read my notes, sorry. Arizona was subject to that voting rights legislation, Alaska. And then you had some areas where counties, so when we look at North Carolina and we look at Florida and parts of California and parts of South Dakota, for example, there are certain districts that were covered by the Voting Rights Act. And you had scatterings here and there. And I see here even New Hampshire had some coverage. So once again, and then certain districts and areas, even in Michigan, were subject to some parts of the Voting Rights Act. Why? Because of past history. And what were the criteria? It had to have a history of repression and bad behavior, but also very low turnout, especially in proportion to the size of populations, okay? So the Voting Rights Act, as we all know, it was passed through the Senate and the House, but the majority of the vote was largely determined, cut right down regional lines in which non-Southern states voted in favor, and the majority of the Southern states and those states affected did not. What happened after the Voting Rights Act was a major expansion within 2 years of African Americans who were registered to vote. I don't have data for other groups, but it also went up. So I'm pretty sure when we look at Mexican Americans and especially Asian Americans in certain pockets of California who had been in the country since that, because remember the Chinese Exclusion Act in some parts of California, I'm pretty certain that you would have seen an escalation in the number of those registered as well. And probably if we controlled for wealth, poor whites versus middle income and upwardly mobile whites, you probably also see that expansion. But it's much more obvious amongst African Americans. So for example, in Louisiana, before and in the South, which is really the cultural, historical home base for African Americans, where you have the largest concentration of African Americans. So in Mississippi, in 1965, 5% of African Americans were registered to vote, but within 2 years of the 65 Act, 60% were registered. And remember the voter repression, the fear, the intimidation, the assassination of very powerful Emmett Till. All of those events have to be understood as a repressive force. In Virginia, you see 38% goes up to 57%. In the same decade, the court viewed voting rights as a fundamental constitutional right. And the court tended to lean towards this notion that the Constitution just blatantly was the document that really did ossify this notion that all Americans who are citizens have the right to vote, despite the fact that the states retain certain powers. Okay? Very important. This is the era in which we have a court that's respected, and a court that's largely made of justices that view the Constitution as being the strongest instrument to guarantee and protect American voting rights. But our court does not remain the same, as you know. The court plays a role here because there are different and conflictual jurisprudence ideas. And the courts are, I always ask my students, are the courts really politically neutral? For the most part, they can be. They should be, we all agree, but the reality is that they can shift when you have different makeups. And that makeup is determined indirectly by voting and who votes in individuals who make the decisions about who will be on the court's power, right? So what has happened since 65? I would say, and this is just my opinion, you saw, I would actually characterize the post-civil rights era as being parallel to and very similar to the post-Reconstruction era, in which we've seen at least 4 decades of efforts to roll back everything that was achieved up until 65, and I would say up in the 70s. So we've seen this kind of system. By 79, 80, the assault, in my opinion, really mounted very effectively. And it's occurred in many different ways, and I see it's like 7:27. I will try to wrap up very quickly. So on the one hand, we have seen some expansion of voting rights, but simultaneously, we've seen the imposition of restrictions, new laws and rules, and also the mechanism of districting and redistricting that have affected not only voter access, but affected representation and political party dominance. And although the connection is not necessarily, we elect legislatures that have the authority to district and redistrict. And what we've seen systematically occur in not only the South, but parts of the West and the Midwest, we've seen partisan politics become so brutal that minority parties have been able to capture power of state legislatures and redistrict to the extent that what is, on in very mathematical terms, really not impossible, it becomes possible because of the way districts are drawn. And that's what's going on in Alabama right now. So if you have a state in which you have majority partisanship, those who declare themselves as being Democrat, right? But you have an outcome in which the majority of the legislature and all the representatives are Republican, then is that another form of repression? Because if the majority is being controlled by the minority, our Constitution has two throughways: the majority, the tyranny of the majority, but then there's also the tyranny of the minority. And if the minority comes to power and is able to manipulate districts and rewrite voter access requirement or processes and so on and so forth, is that also not a form of suppression or repression? And it doesn't cut clearly and only along the lines of race. You get geography, interests, and so on and so forth. So I think the bottom line of what I'm saying is that when we talk about voter repression, it affects all of us. It cuts across everyone and can impact everyone. So on the one hand, over the past few decades, we've seen such innovations such as motor voter, same-day motor voter act that allows registration. Connecticut allows one to register to vote when one gets their license and renews their license. That's the motor voter act. And we've seen same-day voting, for example. We've seen early voting. We've also seen efforts to give back the vote or ban the box. So formerly incarcerated individuals in many states now, more and more states are moving to allow them to recapture their voting rights once they have served their time. So those are inclusive measures, but at the same time that we've seen those inclusive measures, we've seen systematic measures that repress some of the very people that are now included through other means, such as stricter ID laws, such as the redistricting, as I said, is another way of repressing the vote, because the whole point of voting is for one's voice to be heard and one's interests to be heard and one's interests to be represented by those that you choose. But if you're in a districting formula in which those that are opposed to your views will always be elected, even though collectively those of like mind are the majority, the outcome of the vote, ergo your vote, has been squashed, so to speak, to the point that that pessimistic view, my vote doesn't count. People who make that observation are not making it simply because they're perhaps not making it because they are delusional. It may be because their representation, their potential to get to elect representatives has been repressed. I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions? Have I said something that strikes someone as being untoward, or anything that you'd like to share or discuss?
The first question we have is in regard to the book we're going to be discussing next week, One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. While Joan was reading that, she said, the observation that jumps out to me from this book is that white supremacy is the overarching project of these countries' history and manifests throughout multiple and diverse social structures and institutions, including but not exclusive to voting structures and processes. Would you be willing to comment on that?
Well, I think that was the point I was making, Joan, in terms of the most obvious outcome of voter repression cuts along lines of race, and because it's the easiest to observe. But I would go even further and argue that there are other outcomes that are measurable in terms of economics and individuals' position in society and certain attitudes and preferences as well. It's so race is always the first layer that we can observe. But even once we pull back that layer, so if all the Black people were to leave the country and all the non-white people were to disappear, my argument is that you would still have a power struggle, and the most obvious one that would jump out would probably be would be along the lines of interest, resources, however you want to articulate inequality. And so that's my argument. So I would agree, but I would say we shouldn't stop there because it goes beyond that as well. One of the very interesting comments that I've heard recently has come about in terms of this new conversation about whether or not our incumbent president is too old to run for office, right? And so you have certain members of Congress, I will not name, who are coming out, yeah, well, I think that, we should have an age limit and a term limits and so on and so forth. And what that tells me is that just like in the 60s, remember the 60s also had another layer of social upheaval and change, and that was generational. And so you have this view among some now that some of us with gray hair should just get out of the way, right? Because the interest, and this really does become apparent when we look at the student loan forgiveness and the attitudes about student loan forgiveness. And so you have this huge number of young people who have very different interests, who at some point may very well argue that their interests are being repressed because they're being repressed, and if their access to may recognize that some of the because some of the voter repression laws that are occurring very obviously in certain parts of, say, I know this comes out of Georgia as well as North Carolina, the whole question about college students' access to the polls and the whole controversy as to whether or not students should be able to register to vote on campus using their campus address. And the life of a college student is such that elections generally occur, I think they kind of fall around midterm time. And if you're registered to vote, you're out of state, right? And you're only able to vote in your hometown. For many students, unless you've established residency, that's a huge impediment. And so altering the laws and the student loan debt forgiveness controversy will or legislation will be resolved and would be resolved probably very differently if you did have greater student representation and access to the polls. So, Joan, what I'm saying is I agree, but I think that it's like the onion, right? That's the most obvious. We start with that one, we pull that, we pull that skin off, and then we say, oh, wait a minute, there's something else. I know this will, if we go back to 2000 and the controversy about Florida's ballots, there were many of the ballots that were under scrutiny and that were being challenged were ballots that were cast by Florida's senior citizen population. And as I recall, there were even comments and statements that came out, well, if they don't, if they don't know how to punch a Chad, they don't deserve the right to vote, which would have meant, and so even the structure of the ballot could be subtly repressive. And we've had battles in terms of multilingual ballots as well, because if you can't read it, or, if you are challenged to, punch a Chad, should your vote be discounted? Well, if the prevailing view is, yes, you're too stupid to know how to punch a Chad, then that is a determination that people who can't punch a Chad don't have a right or voice or right to say anything. So I think all of it is true, but we have to think a little bit, deeper in terms of, the actual, just how deep voter repression can actually go, and ask some very hard questions. Well, who's benefiting from it? From the repression. So we have race, but then we also have, a very unequal society in many, many other areas as well. And those outcomes are very important to recognize as well. So I hope I've kind of answered. It's all of it. Any other questions? I could go through many of the cases. I do see something that popped up. It seems that people in power need people who are not in power.
I know what you mean.
Oh,
it seems that people in power need to have people without power.
And so the next question I, as a professor, would say, for what, right? Why? And there are multiplicity of possible answers, right down to, psychological. I don't feel good about myself unless I have somebody to step on. I don't know. So we can approach that answer on many different levels. And that's why I began with that notion of power. The last thing that I wanted to point out, and something that is coming up when we talk about voter repression, there are those that, oh, by the way, in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder tore out those sections of the Voting Rights Act that were very important to the inclusion of African Americans and other non-whites. And Section 4 and Section 5 were on a 5-4 court split vote. They were removed. So what pre-clearance did was open the door not only for those states that were subject to the Voting Rights Act, but states all across the country, right? So this is when we start to see Wisconsin, right? And Michigan and other parts of the country that we didn't largely think would be in the business of repressing people and excluding people from the vote. But the removal of the Voting Rights Act not only opened the door for new and another phase and another era of different forms of voter repression, but it opened the door for all of the 50 states to do it, because the Voting Rights Act served as a deterrent not only for those post-Civil War states or post-Reconstruction Jim Crow states, but for the whole nation as a whole, right? But without that, now everybody can do it. And so we're seeing some real interesting voter and voter manipulations occurring in states that typically, historically, we didn't think that they would have these issues developing. As I said, like with Wisconsin, but we've also seen demographic changes as well. So some of the and then there's Texas. Texas has not only created some very strict voter ID laws, it has also, and in some states, by the way, it is easier to get a gun license. And I'm not making a political statement here. I'm stating fact. It's easier to get a gun license than it is to register to vote. And Texas is one of those states. And in Texas, you've not only seen this systematic kind of stricter and stricter voter ID laws, you've also seen for some counties like Harris County, stricter and stricter state legislative oversight on the courts, as well as some of the way in which elections are held in those counties. I mentioned earlier those non-legal ways of voter repression. So you have in Georgia, and this was very controversial, the legislature passed a restrictions on, for example, people giving people water in line to vote. Or you've seen other systemic manipulations, such as allowing early voting, but limiting the number of drop boxes. So one county will have just one drop box for early voting. So what's the point? Especially if you don't have access. And even the precinct rearrangements, those are all forms and mechanisms of that have the consequence of repressing the vote. And for all that we know, it would have to be litigated through the courts. But if you have a court that is inclined to agree with some of the ideas leading to these new forms of repression, that becomes problematic as well. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about, or mention that this new view that, so gerrymandering is rampant. I mean, it's on the rise, and that's when you get those outcomes in which you can have a minority party controlling an entire state. And so the majority partisan, in terms of partisanship, and the majority partisans do not have the ability to achieve full representation. And I would say that is voter repression. But many are also observing and think that voter repression is, since the end of the section 4 and 5 of Shelby versus Holder, you have seen a dramatic decline in the voter turnout. So even registered voters in states with high levels of voter, more repressive voting, voter laws, stricter and stricter laws, you've seen they've been very effective, very effective. You've seen, for example, voter turnout in some states that went from, previously where you had very high voter turnout. And by the way, in the United States, there is this overall issue of voter turnout. We don't turn out to vote for some elections, even though we do have the right to vote. So that's another problem. So our overall voter turnout tends to be less than 50% nationwide. And in some states and districts, it's even lower than that. So you have election outcomes being determined by like 20% of the registered voters. And then put on top of that more restrictive laws. We've seen this dramatic, quantitative, empirically observable decline in voter turnout. And it becomes very psychological. Why bother, right, to vote as well. Another point I just wanted to mention was this whole question about getting on the ballot. Another way of affecting election outcomes, and this is not a political, this is just something that I would study as a political scientist, and that is this view now that not only when we study voter repression and electoral systems, not only do we ask how the vote occurs, who can vote, how are they encouraged to vote, how are they stopped, but we have to also ask who can run for office, who can get on the ballot, and what are the criteria. And so many states are are now dabbling, and there are some intellectual debates about access to coming up with, and this happens within states, because states determine what percentage of the vote actors or candidates must gain in order to be listed on the ballot. And you all know probably from even Bloomfield politics, the whole question of how you're listed on the ballot. Are you on the top? Are you on the bottom? Those are all, I think, all inclusive of our discussion of election outcomes, and perhaps even voter repression. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I have hit on points that help to clarify and interest you. And if there are any other questions, I would love to hear.
We did just have a comment in the chat that said there is a line of analysis about voter suppression that it is largely driven by the Republican Party, which has realized that its policies are unpopular for the American people, so that they can only get elected by, for example, gerrymandering or otherwise suppressing certain districts. Would you agree with that?
I would say, well, that's the power equation. And at this point in our nation's extremely polarized history, I would agree. And that's why you have certain states where numerically Democrats are majority. One party is the majority, but the minority party is ruling. And one of the reasons that it is ruling, or has been ruling for about 10 years, a decade, maybe a decade and a half, is because of the systematic acquisition of power and reconstruction of voting, new voter registration restrictions, as well as gerrymandering. But at the same time, interestingly, that this is occurring, you've seen an expansion of voters as well. So the right to regain one's right to vote after being after being incarcerated. But it's very paradoxical because, you know, on one hand, you have the right to vote, but on the other hand, you're restricted. So yeah, I would say we are, as a country, in another very critical defining eras. And many have labeled what we're going through as being a second or third Reconstruction, or end of a second or third Reconstruction.
I found that description really helpful. And when it gets frustrating to know that, you know, it is a wave of history like any other.
Yes. And it's not only occurring here, it's occurring globally. So that's why I think we also need to look at what's going on globally, and the view globally that we are in a kind of a real struggle in which the world is being divided between countries that still embrace, as imperfect as they are, democracy, versus this real totalitarian, authoritarian temptation that's occurring in some major regions and era. We are a bifurcated world ideologically, and how we get through this, our era, I think, will be a very important for the world. So we have to get through this as well. And then I think that one thing that is hugely important, and that is we are at the precipice of probably a major generational shift. And I think that's one of the messages that Mitt Romney was making, in terms of at least his personal decision to leave. Although, you know, that too is very controversial. And we get into a whole different area discussing what are the qualities and what are the standards of leadership that we want to ensure, regardless of age. And unfortunately, we've seen a kind of institutional decline, and even standards of, in my opinion, in terms of our what we're seeing in the political amongst some in our leadership. And it's complex, and it has some long-term consequences that should be taken very seriously, I think.